The summer of 1863 brought the American Civil War to a violent and critical turning point as Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army of Northern Virginia pushed deep into Union territory. Following brilliant Confederate victories at places like Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, Lee sought to strike a decisive blow on Northern soil, hoping to break the political will of Washington and force a negotiated peace. Unbeknownst to the main bodies of both armies, a chance encounter on July 1st near the small, dusty crossroads town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, sparked a massive collision. The Union cavalry, under the sharp eye of General John Buford, recognized the vital tactical importance of the high ground south of town, specifically the ridges and hills known as Cemetery Hill, Culp's Hill, and the two rocky promontories called Little Round Top and Big Round Top. Buford made a desperate stand, dismounting his troopers to hold the ridges against overwhelming Confederate infantry waves until Union reinforcements could arrive. By nightfall, the Union forces had secured the high ground, setting the stage for a titanic struggle that would decide the fate of a fractured nation. As the second day of battle dawned on July 2nd, the tactical situation grew perilous for the Union Army. General James Longstreet led a ferocious Confederate assault aimed at rolling up the Union left flank. At the absolute southern anchor of this line stood Little Round Top, a rugged, wooded hill that, if captured by the Confederates, would allow them to emplace artillery and enfilade the entire Union position, potentially winning the battle and the war. Defending this critical anchor was the 20th Maine Regiment, commanded by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain, a former college professor turned soldier. Outnumbered, completely out of ammunition, and facing relentless charges by the Alabama regiments, Chamberlain refused to retreat. Realizing that his line was about to break under the sheer weight of the enemy, he made a split-second, desperate gamble. He ordered his men to fix bayonets and execute a sweeping left-wheel charge down the hillside like a revolving door. The sudden, ferocious-looking counterattack shocked the exhausted Confederates, capturing hundreds of prisoners and permanently saving the Union left flank from collapse. The chaos on Little Round Top during Chamberlain's defense was a crucible of raw human survival and tactical grit. For hours, the men of the 20th Maine endured wave after wave of intense Confederate attacks led by the fierce Texans and Alabamians of Hood's division. The heat was suffocating, the noise deafening, and the thirst unbearable. Men fought from behind every available rock, tree, and ledge, firing until their rifle barrels grew too hot to touch. When the order to fix bayonets was given, it was not born of military textbook strategy, but of absolute desperation. The regiment had run completely out of standard ammunition, and the line was fracturing under pressure. By charging down the hill with cold steel, the 20th Maine created an illusion of overwhelming force. The startled Confederate soldiers, exhausted from a grueling march and intense climbing, broke ranks and surrendered in droves. This brilliant tactical improvisation preserved the integrity of the entire Union line and etched the name of Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain into American military lore. Behind the Confederate lines, a profound tactical disagreement cast a dark shadow over the command tent. General James Longstreet, whom Lee affectionately called his old war horse, strongly disagreed with Lee's aggressive strategy for July 2nd. Longstreet believed that the Union Army was too well entrenched on the high ground and argued instead for a strategic movement to the right, maneuvering around the Union flank to position the Confederate Army between Washington, D.C. and Meade's forces, forcing the Union to attack them on ground of Confederate choosing. But Robert E. Lee, flushed with past successes and possessing an unshakable faith in the invincibility of his veterans, rejected the maneuver. He ordered Longstreet to launch a massive coordinated attack against the Union left. Longstreet, bound by duty and honor, obeyed his commanding general's orders, but did so with a heavy heart and a profound sense of foreboding. The resulting assaults across the infamous Peach Orchard, the Wheat Field, and Devil's Den resulted in horrific carnage on both sides, chewing up entire brigades without cracking the main Union defense line. The central fighting on the afternoon of July 2nd degenerated into a nightmarish meat grinder across a series of civilian farmlands that would forever be seared into American memory. General Daniel Sickles, acting independently and against orders, had advanced his Union Third Corps forward into an exposed salient at a local peach orchard, hoping to seize higher ground. Instead, his forward position left his flanks hanging in the air, vulnerable to Longstreet's crushing onslaught. As Confederate artillery opened up with devastating crossfires, infantry divisions surged into the orchard and an adjacent boulder-strewn ravine known appropriately as Devil's Den. The combat was brutal, personal, and shockingly lethal. Regiments fought back and forth across the wheat field so many times that ownership of the blood-soaked acreage changed hands 5 times in a single afternoon. When the smoke finally cleared, thousands of dead and wounded soldiers littered the once serene landscape, turning the peaceful agricultural valley into a gruesome monument to the cost of war. As midnight descended upon Gettysburg on July 2nd, the exhausted Union leadership gathered in the cramped parlor of the Leicester House, General Meade's temporary headquarters, to hold a fateful council of war. The day had brought immense stress. Both flanks of the Union Army had been severely tested, and casualties were mounting into the thousands. Meade opened the meeting by asking his generals a direct and solemn question. Should the Army stay and fight, or should it retreat under the cover of darkness? One by one, the Corps commanders weighed in. Despite the heavy losses and the battered state of their divisions, the unanimous consensus among the generals was clear and resolute. The Army would stay and fight it out. They recognized that the position on Cemetery Ridge was too strong to abandon easily, and morale, despite the exhaustion, remained resilient. General Meade listened carefully, nodded, and delivered a short, historic verdict. Such, then, is the decision. The Union Army would stand its ground, bracing itself for whatever Lee might hurl at them on the third and final day. The morning of July 3rd began with an eerie, deceptive quiet that hung heavily over the rolling Pennsylvania countryside. Unlike the frantic, chaotic dawn of the previous 2 days, the early hours offered a brief, haunting respite from the killing. Soldiers on both sides used the quiet to tend to their wounded, scavenge for ammunition, and write final, poignant letters home to families who would soon learn the dreadful toll of the battle. Behind the Confederate lines, however, General Robert E. Lee was already orchestrating his final, desperate masterstroke. Convinced that the Union center on Cemetery Ridge must be weak after absorbing 2 days of relentless punishment on its flanks, Lee resolved to strike directly at the heart of Meade's line. He assembled a massive force of fresh and battle-hardened divisions, placing the operation under the command of General George Pickett. Little did the Southern commanders know, the Union Army had spent the night reinforcing that exact center with additional earthworks and massive concentrations of artillery, setting a deadly trap. At precisely 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the silence of Gettysburg was shattered by a deafening roar that shook the very earth. More than 150 Confederate cannons opened fire in a coordinated, thunderous barrage aimed directly at the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. It was one of the largest artillery bombardments in the history of the Western Hemisphere, turning the sky into a furnace of screaming iron and exploding shell fragments. Union batteries immediately answered back, creating an inferno of counter-battery fire that lasted for nearly 2 hours. The noise was so intense that it was reportedly heard clearly in Philadelphia, over 100 miles away. Horses panicked and broke loose. Ammunition caissons exploded in massive, fiery mushroom clouds, and soldiers on both sides hugged the dirt, praying for survival as iron projectiles tore through trees and shattered rock walls. Yet, despite the terrifying spectacle, Much of the Confederate artillery fire overshot the main Union line, doing less structural damage to the infantry defenses than Lee and his artillerists had hoped. As the smoke from the great artillery duel began to drift away at roughly 3 o'clock, a breathtaking and tragic spectacle unfolded across the open fields. Nearly 12,000 Confederate infantrymen, led by the fresh division of General George Pickett alongside brigades from other commands, stepped out of the tree line on Seminary Ridge. Formed into clean parade ground battle lines stretching nearly a mile wide, they began their long exposed march across the gently sloping valley toward the Union center on Cemetery Ridge. As the gray lines advanced, silence briefly gripped the Union side before Federal artillery reopened with double-shotted canister and grape shot, tearing gaping, bloody holes through the advancing ranks. Despite the devastating losses, the Confederate veterans closed ranks with chilling discipline and pressed forward across fences, streams, and meadows. By the time they reached the Emmitsburg Road and faced concentrated rifle fire from behind a low stone wall, the magnificent charge had transformed into a desperate struggle for survival against an unyielding wall of lead and fire. A small fraction of the Confederate assault force, led by the brave General Lewis Armistead, managed to pierce the Union line at a low stone wall known historically as the Angle, the absolute high water mark of the Confederacy. For a few frantic minutes, hand-to-hand combat raged around the captured cannon before overwhelming Union reinforcements rushed into the breach, sealing the gap and capturing or driving back the surviving attackers. The grand charge had failed, leaving thousands of dead and wounded sprawled across the open fields in a heartbreaking display of valor and futility. Realizing the terrible magnitude of the defeat, a heartbroken General Lee rode out to meet the shattered remnants of his army, taking full responsibility for the disaster and telling his men, "It is all my fault." The following day, July 4th, Lee began the long, mournful retreat back toward Virginia under the cover of a torrential rainstorm, while President Lincoln and a grieving nation counted the cost of a battle that claimed over 50,000 casualties. Gettysburg had broken the offensive power of the Confederate Army, ensuring that the Union would ultimately prevail and changing the course of American history forever.